What affects the cost of CCS to the individual?
So this graph discusses how the cost of generation occurs on the electric grid. As we go from the left to the right on the graph, we have increasing electricity demand from consumers. And as you go from the bottom to the top of the graph, you have an increasing operating cost. And the way that power plants are told to dispatch and generate electricity on the grid is that the least cost operating power plants are the power plants that are told to generate the first. So the lowest operating cost power plants on the grid are wind power plants. They're low operating costs because they have no fuel costs and low maintenance costs. The next most expensive power plant on the electric grid are typically nuclear power plants. The next most expensive after that are typically the coal power plants, and then lastly the most expensive or next expensive generation power plants on the grid are natural gas plants. These include natural gas combined cycle plants, as well as on the upper end of the curve, older natural gas steam turbines and even potentially natural gas combustion turbines.
What would happen if one coal plant decided to use CCS?
Well, if one coal plant decided to invest in carbon capture technology, his operating costs would go up because he has to operate more equipment and because the carbon capture technology takes away some of the electricity that would otherwise be delivered to the grid. So on this graph, what that looks like is we can imagine a particular coal plant deciding to engage in carbon capture, and his operating costs would now increase. Because his operating costs increase, he would now be dispatched less on the electric grid because his operating costs are now equivalent to power plants over here on the right side of the grid, on the right side of the graph. So now this coal plant would reside here in what we call the dispatch order of power plants. And the further you are to the right in the graph, the less you actually generate electricity and deliver it to the grid. The further you are to the left, the more often you generate electricity and deliver it to the grid. So what that means is this particular single coal plant would actually sell less electricity, and if they sell less electricity, that becomes harder for them to maintain a profit.
So what's the economic incentive for a coal plant to invest in CCS?
The reason is there is a buyer for the carbon dioxide that they would capture. Therefore, they can sell the carbon dioxide to this buyer and make back the money that they need to invest in carbon capture and storage. These buyers are oil operators who can use the carbon dioxide to get more oil out of the ground from mature oil fields in Texas, and this is called carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery. So the oil operators engage in a business deal with the coal plant operators and create a business that otherwise did not exist before carbon capture and storage.
Selling CO2 for EOR explains why one coal plant might invest in CCS. What would cause many coal plants to use CCS?
So today, when power plants emit certain substances, they can be charged for those emissions. An example of these substances are emissions that cause ozone formation in the lower atmosphere. And because ozone is harmful to human health, these are regulated by the government, and there are prices put on these emissions in certain markets. Equivalently, in the future, we could choose to regulate carbon dioxide emissions, and there could be a price put on emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The green curve here shows an example of how the cost of electricity generation would increase if there were a carbon dioxide price. Coal plants increase their operating costs by a certain amount, and natural gas power plants increase their operating costs by a lesser amount because they emit less carbon dioxide for every unit of electricity, approximately half the amount of carbon dioxide for every unit of electricity than do coal plants. If the carbon dioxide price is below a certain threshold, the coal power plant's operating cost is still below that of the natural gas power plants, and the dispatch order of the electricity system is approximately the same as it was as if there were no price on carbon dioxide emission. But if the carbon dioxide price is high enough, all of a sudden the operating costs of coal-fired power plants can become higher than the operating costs of natural gas-fired power plants. And in this case, the coal-fired power plants would now be incentivized to invest in carbon capture and storage, in order to lower their operating costs below that of natural gas-fired power plants so that they can continue to be dispatched on the electric grid and sell electricity.
So it's a complicated grid controlled by operating cost and dispatch order. What's that mean for the cost to the consumer?
If there were a single coal plant that provided electricity to your home, and this was the only source of electricity, the full cost of operating that coal-fired power plant could get passed on to you as the consumer. And in that case, the price of electricity generation from that coal plant would increase approximately 5 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour in order to engage in carbon capture and sequestration. However, as we saw, the electric grid is a lot more complicated than a single power plant operating and delivering electricity to your house. In Texas, natural gas power plants play a large role, and these are the marginal generators, so they dictate the price of electricity more so than do coal-fired power plants. If a carbon dioxide price were applied to the entire electric grid, the price increase of electricity generation may not increase the entire 5 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour if coal plants capture carbon dioxide. It will increase proportional to the cost for a natural gas power plant to emit carbon dioxide. Therefore, your retail costs might only increase 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Or so the price of your electricity, instead of being 11 cents a kilowatt hour with no price on carbon dioxide emissions, might be in the range of 14 to 16 cents a kilowatt hour if there were carbon capture and sequestration from coal plants on the grid and a price of CO2 emissions applied to both coal plants and natural gas plants.
For more information about CCS, please visit storeco2now.com or beg.utexas.edu/gccc.